My name's Phil Murphy. I live in a 23-storey block of flats where I'm chair of the Residents Association. I live on the 8th floor and we have one single escape staircase in that block of flats. In former lives I've been a member of the Armed Services and for 12 years a proud member of the FBU as a firefighter and a fire safety officer. For the last 8 years I've been working in property management, managing a whole range of buildings from residential to otherwise, some of which were very, very large. The tragic events that we saw unfold at Grenfell will have struck fear into the hearts of all firefighters everywhere, particularly the speed of the fire spread on the outside of that building. Buildings such as that and such as my own, which were designed with a single staircase, were designed with one threat of fire in mind, and that's internal. And the introduction of flammable external features carries with it a threat to surpass the fire compartmentation that keeps every resident in flats just like that safe as they sleep at night. It's the demography of the 250 tenants approximately in Stretford House. I live very close to a blind man. I know people that can't use stairs. I know people that are in wheelchairs. And like any other place where people live, there's people there that are caring for their loved ones in their final days. It's a diverse population. I'll take you through events as they've unfolded over the last couple of weeks, as I've tried to act in the best interests of the tenants of the block where I live, and endeavoured for them to achieve the highest possible standards of fire safety in that building, and I hope sincerely to be helpful to other high-rise communities as well. As far back as last year, for over a year now, I've been raising concerns about fire safety in Trafford Housing Trust's Stretford House, including my concerns relating to the Fire Risk Assessment and to the general fire safety management, which I thought was very relaxed considering the number of people living in a building with a single escape staircase. I raised further concerns this year when it was revealed that there are a lot of dryers around. Indesit, I think, were the first to recall their dryers as being likely to cause fires. As residents in a high-rise block, we don't have any outside areas to dry our clothes. I went to the Trafford Housing Trust with this concern because a lot more people than average will own these clothes dryers in these flats, and that's naturally a cause for concern, particularly given the demographic of the residents in there. On the 14th of June, in the early hours of the morning, the horrors of Grenfell Tower began to unfold in front of all of us on our television sets and on the radios and in the newspapers. That day I contacted Trafford Housing Trust as a matter of urgency, emphasising the concerns I'd raised in the past and asking for an immediate meeting with the director responsible for compliance across the entirety of Trafford Housing Trust's residential properties. I was told that meeting could take place on Friday. On the Wednesday night, in order to draw attention to the plight of tenants in high-rise blocks such as these, I did an interview on a television station which is the German equivalent of Radio 4's World Service, the televisual equivalent of that. And the next day, this is now the Thursday, I wrote to Kate Green and invited her to the meeting I was having on Friday with Trafford Housing Trust. Initially she declined. and I sent a link so that she could have a look at the interview that I'd done the previous evening on the television, and she came back and had changed her mind and decided that she wanted to come to the meeting I was having with Trafford Housing Trust. At that meeting on Friday, it was ensured by the Director of Property Services, who looks after regulatory compliance in all the Trafford Housing Trust buildings, that everything was fine, and that they'd been through the 2016 Fire Risk Assessment for the building, and that all concerns were being addressed. This Fire Risk Assessment was done in July 2016. So immediately when he said that they were dealing with the concerns, I was worried that perhaps they hadn't acted with the haste that they are urged to do when faults are found in a fire risk assessment. I took a copy that they gave me of that 2000 fire risk assessment, went home that Friday night, and I got up on the Saturday morning and I read that fire risk assessment. In 20 years I've been a health and safety practitioner. I've never seen such a mismanagement of safety that's critical to people's lives. I was appalled. I was astounded. Having gone the complaints route with Trafford Housing Trust previously, on the back of them installing a communal energy system that's charging all tenants in the block more than twice the commercial going rate per kilowatt hour for their energy and heating systems, I knew that this was a long and laborious process, and I concluded that I need to compile a more well-researched and a more impactful document to draw the attention that was needed to the plight of people in Stretford House, to my neighbours. So on that Saturday morning I started to write a document. It involved me refreshing a lot of study that I'd done in the past on fire engineering with the Institution of Fire Engineers. I had to update myself as to the relevant compliance, the relevant safety issues, the relevant regulations, the relevant tests, the relevant British Building Research Establishment guidance, the relevant DCLG guidance. And at about 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, I finished it, having not had a great deal of sleep. I sent it to Matthew Gardner at Trafford Housing Trust, the Chief Exec. I sent it to Kate Green, RMP. I sent it to David Acton, Chair of Greater Manchester Combined Authorities Fire Authority, and I sent it to the GM Mayor, Andy Burnham. When I woke the next morning, I saw that the Chief Exec from Trafford Housing Trust had replied at 4 o'clock in the morning. By 11 o'clock that morning, they had housing officers in the foyers of every high-rise block in Trafford, reassuring tenants and addressing their concerns and recruiting volunteers for a new panel that they'd set up, the high-rise panel, exclusively for people that lived in high-rise blocks, with a direct line of communication with the board. So the reaction to the concerns I raised about how worried people were and how much support people were in need of were reacted to well and swiftly, I felt. The technical aspects of my concerns raised had not yet, though, been addressed. I was aware that these might take some time more to get to the bottom of, but I'll tell you briefly what I found in the fire risk assessment document, which was no small document itself. I had to dissect it in some detail. I've called it a forensic micro-analysis because I read it about 6 times, I think. And it's not always easy, without any knowledge, to dissect and interpret what's in these documents. Briefly, there's one staircase. After the installation of a communal energy system 6 years ago, the pipes ran through the building in many places to many flats. Going between the floors in this way breaches the compartmentation that was built into the building in dozens, perhaps hundreds of places. On the escape routes to the said stairs, the pipes were boxed in with wood that had not been tested to fire safety and fire resistance standards. There was no evidence to show that the fire alarm worked at all. The fire alarm was minimal, They're for health and safety purposes to protect employees in the building. There are no detectors on each floor. There are no detectors in the flats. Regardless of that, it hadn't been tested. So employees, as well as residents, were unsafe in those flats. There was nothing to suggest that the fire alarm was connected to a monitoring station that would mobilise the fire services in the event of an activation of that fire alarm. There was no evidence whatsoever that the emergency lighting system was working. There was no evidence whatsoever that the dry riser system was working. There was no fire evacuation procedures for any of the residents or personal evacuation plans for any that had disabilities or difficulties of any nature. And the housing managers had not followed the Chief Fire Officers Association's guidelines in choosing a fire risk assessor because they'd wholeheartedly failed to recognise the 250 people in those flats as a high life risk. That is common across the country, that managers of high-rise residential accommodations, tenant management organisations and housing trusts have previously, most of them, failed to recognise the risk. That means they've failed to appoint the correct level of expertise to do their fire risk assessments. They've failed to recognise the risk posed by multiple failures within a fire risk assessment like this, and totally failed to recognise the potential for a large loss of life in the event of a catastrophe of this nature. So, moving on. At this point, knowing that Trafford Housing Trust were talking to residents and planned future sessions to communicate with all residents, absorb their concerns and respond to them accordingly, I didn't feel that I had any choice but to sit on the findings of my report. Many of my neighbours and residents there were at this point very, very afraid, having seen the events unfold at Grenfell Tower. They were living in fear. If I'd have unveiled to them what I'd found at that block, it simply wouldn't have been fair. Those that had somewhere else to go would have moved out, and those that didn't wouldn't, while the fight with Trafford Housing Trust went on. I was quite confident that the emergency lights did work, that the dry riser did work, and that the fire alarm did work, and that the fire doors had been checked to some degree, but that the paperwork wasn't in place. But the point is, without that paperwork, you don't know if the system is fit for purpose, and you don't know what was wrong with it according to the last inspection. Without seeing any of that paperwork, you don't know if it's fit for purpose. It usually is. And when that paperwork isn't available, it's usually an administrative error. But nevertheless, it's a statutory contravention of the Regulatory Reform Order of Fire Safety, which was written in 2005 and came into force in 2006, effectively privatising the fire inspection industry that was previously the responsibility of public fire services. Fire certificates at that point became null and void, and it was the responsibility of building managers and private organisations and employers to find a fire risk assessor. When they did that, they did it without any guidance as to how to select an appropriate fire risk assessor. That advice has since come forward from the Chief Fire Officers Association, but it doesn't apply to your average workplace. Organisations such as IOSH and NEBOSH will give fire safety training courses, and if you look carefully at their literature, it does actually make clear that that will train the person to risk assess your average low risk workplace. All over the country, those people have been risk assessing high life risk buildings such as this, and that was the case with the 2006 report that they'd given to me that I read. It was written by somebody with a tech IOSH. There is guidance out there that they should have been following. It's the guide to purpose-built blocks of flats, and in there it gives 4 grades of fire risk assessor. And the highest grade, which are currently used in hospitals and high life risk premises, will go into rooms. It will test the permeability of the materials that are proposed as fire barriers. It will test the fire doors. It will forensically examine the fire safety systems and the fire safety features in a building. The likes of Stretford House have never had that, never. And they should have been receiving it ever since 2006, frankly. Now, on Friday morning, I asked the managers at Trafford Housing Trust, having given them enough time to get the ducks in a row, I asked them for the paperwork to prove that the dry riser, the emergency lighting, the fire doors and the fire alarm system were all checked and fit for purpose. I was still waiting for that on Friday evening. I resigned myself to having to wait until Monday. That was up until Saturday night, when I saw the scenes on television of various blocks in Camden being completely evacuated. 800 homes were being evacuated, approximately 3,000 people, with some force, I might add. And at that point, I decided that the decision would no longer be mine to take, and that would make the report public on social media on the Sunday. I'd chosen social media as my preferred form of attack against Trafford Housing Trust, because they're very keen on their brand and their image, and they like to be seen as an organisation that exercises considerable corporate social responsibility. I read with interest with regard to the cleaners' strike in London, at the University of London last year, the manner in which they constructed their objections and their strike strategy. Instead of trying to get people in suits into a meeting room, they launched an all-out attack in public on what I've called corporate social irresponsibility. They've attacked the brand in public, and it worked. This is a new form of industrial action that needs to be taken seriously, and that has seemed to be effective, is attacking one thing that all such organisations hold very close to their heart and protect with all their will. That's their image and their brand. If you attack that, you hurt them. So I put the report up on my website, and within 48 hours it was downloaded 100 times. I've done another television interview, I've done a Guardian interview, I've done an MEN interview, so I knew I was starting to reach them. And I was invited to a meeting at a place that I used to work, Stretford Fire Station, for a meeting with the Chief Exec of Trafford Housing Trust and many of the councillors representing residents in Trafford. The senior fire officer for the area was there, as was a senior police officer. The meeting was opened by Matthew Gardner, the Chief Exec of Trafford Housing Trust, with a lovely speech about how well they'd responded to the concerns of tenants having people in the blocks, and applauding themselves, in short, for their human reaction to the tragedy. Given an opportunity to speak, I pointed out their failings in the technical department and the fact that people in Stretford House were still desperately afraid, and there was no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the fire safety systems in those buildings worked at all. And there was evidence to suggest in the fire safety risk assessment that there were multiple breaches in the fire compartmentation in that building. I previously received a copy of the 2013 risk assessment that found there were multiple breaches in the compartmentation within that building. In simple terms, that means that the fire can vertically spread unabated in a way that the building was designed to prevent. So I humiliated Matthew Gardner in front of his peers necessarily. As I was drawing to a close, The points I was making, the senior fire safety officer stood up and told the meeting that he intended to send another senior fire safety officer to the building as soon as physically possible. So serious were his concerns for the residents in that block. I backed Matthew Gardner into a corner and he said, I have got the money to spend on an L1 fire alarm system. That's a system of the same specification that you'll see in hospitals where people are deaf, people are ill, and people can't use stairs. That's the kind of protection that should have been given to residents in this block all the time. I received an assurance from him that sprinklers would be fitted to the escape staircase in Stretford House. Two crucial elements in escaping from a fire in a building are the warning that you were given, the time that you're allowed to escape. The sooner after the breakout of fire is discovered, you need to know. That's what fire alarm systems do. When there's a fire somewhere in the building, they tell everybody in the building to get out. The second critical element is your fire escape route. That needs to be clear and safe. If you're warned in good time and you've got a good fire escape route, you'll get out of the building. Interesting to note that the health and safety legislation that protects people at work is somewhat more stringent. It's very, very rare now that people die at work in a fire. So it can be done. If you live above the 3rd floor in flats in the United Kingdom, you're 10 times more likely to die in a fire than somebody that lives in a house. That's a DCLG figure in a document that they published on the risks, the health and safety risks to people in houses. Every 3 days there's a serious fire in a flat somewhere in England. I'm not talking about the minor fires that people put out themselves. I'm talking about the ones that are serious enough to call the fire brigade out. I'm going to say that once more. If you live above the 3rd floor, you're 10 times more likely to die in a fire. It doesn't really apply to the new blocks with all their pressurised escape systems and sprinklers and the integrated detailed fire alarms and phased and gradual evacuation plans. Those buildings are relatively safe. It's the older buildings, the social housing, where people are dying in flats. Yesterday afternoon, I asked my committee, the residents committee, to meet. And again, I brought along the compliance director from Trafford Housing Trust, who now produced the paperwork to show us that the fire system worked, that the dry riser worked, and that the emergency lighting worked. Myself and other committee members could start to relax, and I could unveil the contents of this report. I gave each of the committee a copy of the report and showed them with the reassurance that the findings of the report and the risk assessment that suggested that the emergency lighting, the dry riser, etc. may not be working had been resolved. All of those systems were working. But one serious concern remained, and that was the integrity of the fire stopping that was applied after the installation of the community energy system, which led to breaches between fire compartmentation between the floors. Happily, this morning, first thing, I got a call from a senior fire safety officer at Manchester Fire Service, who is in our flats now, carrying out a deep audit of the fire safety systems, the breaches in the fire compartmentation, and all of the other fire safety features in that building. I've had an assurance from Matthew Gardner that if any failings are found within that inspection, and I'm sure there will be, that we'll be given a walking warden until those faults are put right, to keep the people in Stretford House safe while they sleep in beds. A fire alarm won't hear a scream. A fire alarm won't smell smoke from 3 floors away. Nothing is safer than a walking warden around that building, offering a human presence and the observations that only a human person can give in an environment. So 2 of my committee members have currently got a fire safety officer in their flats, checking the doors and what have you. And tonight I'll be able to tell the tenants that they can all completely relax and I've already started the process of communicating precisely what's gone on in some detail to every person in those flats and to every person in any other block of similar flats that wants to know. I want as many people as possible to learn from what's happened at Trafford Housing Trust. I've brought some details with me. I'm sure Evan will convey my details to all of you that you can all take with you, and if you come across any resident associations or any people that live in any high-rise flats that have concerns, then please pass them my details. I'll be very glad to help them.